Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Milos Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly Forecast Monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly Forecast Monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So Milos, it's been quite another eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking this week?
Yeah, lots going on this week. For a start, the Trump administration has been ramping up pressure on Iran as the regime's crackdown against local protests has led to thousands of protesters dead, according to varying accounts. Then, shifting back to our coverage of the situation in Greenland, we saw the top diplomats of Greenland and Denmark sent over to Washington to negotiate with the US on Greenland's status, while European countries have sent a small number of troops to the island for an initial assessment of how to ensure the country's security ahead of planned joint military exercises. In the Indo-Pacific, US President Donald Trump has formally approved the sale of Nvidia chips to China, despite reservations on both sides remaining, while Japan is preparing for a possible snap election in February. And then finally, in Ukraine, Russia's bombardments against Ukraine's energy infrastructure have continued, while efforts to obtain security guarantees from the United States have stalled.
Got it. Thanks, Milos. So let's start off this week with the Middle East, where, as you mentioned, Milos, there's been quite a lot of activity related to Iran, both within the country and U.S. reactions. So, Andrew, what can you update us on the current state of protests and what we've been seeing out of the U.S. in response to them?
Yeah, quite a flurry of updates, not only from this past week, but from today alone. Just like our coverage last week, we'll start on the ground in Iran. The latest that we understand, or at least can confirm, is that a minimum of 2,571 Iranian protesters are believed to have been killed over the course of the last 18 days as of yesterday, actually, January 14th. One thing that I want to note for listeners is that there are other unnamed sources, of course, unnamed for their own protection inside Iran, who are reporting significantly higher casualty rates among the protesters due to, obviously, conditions on the ground inside Iran right now. Media outlets cannot independently verify those numbers. And again, this is the kind of situation that has rapid updates. So we will keep our eye on the latest and keep listeners informed next week as well. Now, on that note, the Iranian government, and I want to clarify that a lot of these reports are very recent and the dust has not yet settled, but the Iranian government is claiming to have more or less quashed protests across the country, of course, through force. That has had an impact on U.S. President Donald Trump's contemplations over how to proceed in Iran with events on the ground. Of course, something that we've been talking about quite a bit are the American president's threats of military force, specifically regime change operations against the Iranian government if they continued to kill protesters in large numbers, as well as execute protesters who they had captured. The latest that we've seen, and again, I don't want to speculate too much on what is in fact breaking news, but is that Trump is now stepping back from his threats to conduct direct operations inside Iran. There appears to have been a serious joint diplomatic effort from the U.S.'s major Arab partners in the region who, from what we understand, were able to convince the U.S. president that the threats to regional stability, to their own internal security, as well as to global energy markets, would face severe destabilization in the event of a U.S. attack on Iran, especially one that actually did succeed in toppling the regime. The other thing I want to stress is that these options are still on the table. It is still completely possible that the U.S. could attack Iran directly, even though that appears to be much less likely than even what we were assessing earlier this morning. Hybrid options are still very much on the table. In fact, 2 days ago, Trump announced a 25% tariff against, quote, any country doing business with Iran. I do suspect that we will continue to see hybrid escalation from the United States against the Iranians. And then a notable quote from Trump from yesterday. He said that, quote, killing in Iran is stopping. He said that executions that were expected to take place have also been halted. He said, quote, trust me, I have that on good authority. And that appears to be the latest as of now. But again, this is a rapidly changing situation, both on the ground and diplomatically in Washington.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. So yeah, as you mentioned, a lot of activity happening within Iran and in the U.S. response to Iran. So we saw, some signaling, as you mentioned, out of the Trump administration on weighing different responses, both military potentially, as well as hybrid, such as that 25% tariff on countries doing business with Iran. So sort of a thinly veiled threat to countries like Russia and China, which we'll get into in a little bit, but also some notable, at least limited de-escalation as of today. And I should mention we're recording on Thursday, January 15th, on walking back some of that more heavy military response as a result of the diplomatic mediation by some of those Middle Eastern and Arab countries within the Gulf region. So lots to continue to track there on the Iranian front. And in the meantime, we've had some notable developments on the diplomatic side when it comes to Gaza. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, fairly brief but significant diplomatic updates out of Gaza this week. So Hamas has announced that it's willing to dissolve its governing body inside of Gaza once, and this is key, once a Palestinian technocratic committee is in place. Now, that is, of course, is a specific condition that Hamas has agreed to in the U.S. brokered ceasefire deal with Israel. On that note, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff announced that the U.S. is officially moving into phase 2 of the deal, which is aimed primarily at achieving, or perhaps you could say forcing, the disarmament of Hamas. And then, of course, establishing a post-Hamas governing body. Specifically, that technocratic Palestinian committee would, in theory, according to the plan, be overseen by what is being called the Board of Peace, which will be chaired by Trump himself. Now, it's interesting, both Hamas, Israel, and some of the U.S.'s key partners in the region are doubtful of the success of moving into phase 2 of the deal. And there's some very strong reasons for that. Primarily, number one, the remains of one final Israeli hostages inside Gaza have yet to be found and turned over. That, of course, is a significant diplomatic and political issue for the Israelis. And then the other looming issue, of course, is the fact that Hamas has not yet been disarmed and, of course, has not yet committed to a disarmament. And that has a significant impact, a deterring impact on a lot of partners that the U.S. is counting on to contribute forces to the international security force in Gaza.
Understood. And just very briefly to round out the Middle East, there's been some significant military activity in Syria. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so last week we very briefly talked about some very serious fighting that was taking place between the Syrian army, government forces, and the Kurdish-led SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, in the city of Aleppo. There has been kind of an on-again, off-again ceasefire between those two groups with increasing rates of fighting and casualties on both sides. The latest that we understand is that the Syrian army is opening a civilian evacuation corridor in some of the areas around Aleppo. And for context, that is most likely in preparation for a large ground assault from the Syrian army against Kurdish forces.
Understood. So lots to pay attention to there in Syria, and we'll be keeping a very close eye on the Iran and Gaza fronts as well, which we'll update next week. Let's move on now to the U.S. and the Americas. So obviously last week we featured quite heavily the U.S. intervention in Venezuela and some of the ripple effects there. So we'll touch on that in just a moment. But before we get into that, Milos, can you update us on where things stand between the U.S. and Greenland?
Yes, I can. So, as a reminder, after the intervention into Venezuela, one of the talking points from the Trump administration was the interest in acquiring Greenland, and this was said with the reasoning that the island needed increased security, and also that it provided access to various natural resources that would benefit the United States national security. And the administration as a whole hasn't ruled out since then the use of force to acquire Greenland, which naturally has put not only Greenland but also Denmark and the rest of Europe, made them all quite uneasy. So this week we saw that the foreign ministers of both Denmark and Greenland came over to Washington and had a meeting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio as well as Vice President J.D. Vance. The results of the meeting were sort of ambiguous insofar as they did decide and both agree to establish a working group and keep the lines of communication open to continue the discussion going forward. So clearly no decision made yet. That being said, the words from the visiting delegation, was that fundamental disagreements remain. Now, as a result, this hasn't eased tensions in Europe, and as a result, following the meeting, we saw a number of European countries, including Germany, Sweden, Norway, the UK, and the latest to agree to this is France, all of whom have sent troops to Greenland. And the mission, as it were, is twofold. The first is to just get a lay of the land to see what the situation is and how best to contribute to the island's security in a way that could appease the Trump administration, from having to come onto the island necessarily in order to guarantee its security itself. But also, this is in anticipation to joint exercises that would be conducted by the European nations around Greenland. I should also note that one of the latest developments in the United States is that there were enough votes across the aisle in the House of Representatives to introduce legislation that would make any act of aggression against Greenland illegal and would hold accountable any members of the armed forces or of the polity that would be involved in this. So clearly there's still a lot of unease on both sides of the Atlantic regarding this, but for now it seems that discussions are ongoing, and we'll undoubtedly hear more about this in the weeks to come.
Got it. Thanks, Milos. And bringing you back in here, Andrew, what has been going on in Venezuela, both from a diplomatic and a security perspective over the past week since that U.S. intervention?
Yeah, so we'll start with the Venezuela updates this week in Washington, D.C., actually, where there's two significant meetings that are scheduled to take place today on January 15th. The first is that President Trump himself is scheduled to meet with Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado in D.C. This will be their first meeting since Maduro's capture. Also today, representatives from the Trump administration are planning to meet with representative from the interim government in Venezuela, which there's no doubt that Machado will do her best to remain in the administration's good graces during this meeting, but the administration clearly is willing to do business with the interim government. Something that I think is interesting with these back-to-back meetings with opposing parties in Venezuela is that the White House seems to take the same approach to scheduling meetings with its diplomatic negotiations elsewhere. For example, the president has a tendency to call Russian President Vladimir Putin shortly before or after he has an in-person meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. So both of those situations are still developing, and we'll have updates next week. And then one more brief note, the U.S. State Department has warned U.S. citizens to depart the country, Venezuela, as quickly as possible after reports of armed roadblocks being set up to find and capture American citizens.
Understood. So lots to pay attention to there on the Venezuela front. And just I'll quickly update in terms of the implications of this U.S. intervention. We focused last week on some of the energy and particularly oil export implications. So the U.S. seizure of those oil tankers with ties to Venezuela in international waters sort of leading up to and following that intervention, that had the effect of slowing and really stopping most of Venezuela's oil exports. So what we've seen this past week are reports that there have been some reopening of some of the wells in Venezuela after, amid this strict U.S. embargo. And this is, with the U.S. company Chevron being the only U.S. company that's still active there and exporting crude from its joint ventures under this U.S. authorization. So that does seem to be trickling out a little bit more now. I'll also note that there was a high-profile meeting between President Trump and many energy executives, the U.S. oil executives, about resuming investment and operations into Venezuela, which there's been kind of a mixed response to, with many noting that the investment environment right now is still a little bit tricky, to say the least, but still with the goal to kind of ramp up those oil exports. And I'll just finish out by noting that Russia, which had quite a lot of activity and presence with Venezuela, both in the energy sector, but also broadly speaking, we have seen basically Russia speak out against any of the company's assets. In particular, Russian oil firms in Venezuela were the property of Russia, and that Venezuela should stick to its commitments to international partners there, as a sort of a thinly veiled swipe at the U.S. position and what it's trying to do when it comes to Venezuelan energy. So we'll keep a close eye on that and make sure to update in future episodes. But in the meantime, let's move on to another hotspot, which is the Indo-Pacific. So turning back to Milos here, lots of developments between the U.S. and China on the trade and technology front. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, this is a story that hasn't really been at the forefront of the news for the past couple of months, but now has been returning. As this week, the Trump administration gave its formal approval for the US company Nvidia to sell its more advanced microchips to China. Now, this was something that was sort of informally agreed upon back during the fall of 2025, but now has been given the official stamp of approval. And to remind listeners, this concerns Nvidia's H200 chips, which are approximately 6 times more powerful than the chips that China currently is approved to receive from the United States. However, is still a generation behind the most advanced chips that are available to the US market. In the latest news that we've gotten about this approval, however, there are some restrictions that were added to the sale of the chips to China. For a start, they have to be reviewed by a third party, which will be testing to confirm that their technical AI capabilities are sufficient before they can be shipped to China. And in terms of the quantity as well, China cannot receive more than 50% of the total amount of chips sold to the American market. So these are 2 updates that we hadn't previously heard. As a result of this approval, however, we have heard quite a lot of backlash from Congress, with a lot of lawmakers reiterating their concerns that this could have on the national security front, as a lot of these chips could potentially be used by China to advance its military capabilities, as well as the integration of AI models into its own military, which could potentially be an issue in the future if ever there is a Taiwan contingency coming to the fore. Now, the reasoning by the Trump administration is that shipping these chips to China would, in theory, discourage Chinese competitors, such as Huawei, from doubling down on efforts to have a more domestically sourced market for the chips. However, this reasoning has been met with quite a lot of skepticism. And the Chinese government has, in fact, told a lot of its tech companies that they should not be placing any orders of these chips. And we can expect some more guidance from the Chinese government in the coming month regarding the exact guidelines for the purchase of these chips. But what we can expect is that they would probably only be allowed under special circumstances. We're talking research and development potentially, or on a university level. But it seems that the Chinese government on the whole is very much pushing for increased self-reliance, particularly on the tech front. But for now, it seems that they're probably going to be accepting this outreach by the United States on the chip front, at the very least, to keep the negotiating tables open going into the rest of the year.
Got it. And sticking with China on the trade front, some notable developments with both Canada and the EU. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, so we got the news this week that there was some progress made on the negotiation front with trade in particular by China, both with Canada and the EU, as you mentioned. And these are both parties that in the past, and especially under the Biden administration, both Canada and the EU had ramped up their own trade restrictions and sanctions against China, in part under pressure by the United States at the time. But now it seems that both the EU and Canada are kind of tentatively reaching out again to China. For example, the Prime Minister of Canada actually this week, he met with President Xi Jinping as well as the Foreign Minister, and both sides came out of that meeting quite positively, hailing a rekindling of cooperation, especially in the sectors of agriculture and energy. It should be noted that Canada's relations with China turned especially frosty a couple of years ago when they put quite high tariffs on the imports of Chinese electric vehicles. Now, that hasn't been publicly acknowledged this week, though it could be that these discussions that we've had this week are more of a kind of setting the tone situation, that we'll hear more about it in the weeks to come. Electric vehicles did, however, feature a lot on the EU side of things, where the EU actually published its proposal for a minimum price offer for Chinese electric vehicle imports, which in theory could replace the existing tariffs that the EU has on Chinese electric vehicles that currently amounts to around 35%. But it could also benefit the EU automotive industry by using China's large export network to gain access to further markets in Southeast Asia. So clearly we're seeing a lot of hedging going on by Canada and the EU, and I don't think it marks any kind of major strategic shift here, but I do think that we're going to be seeing a lot more diversification, in particular as the above mentioned or aforementioned threats by the US against Greenland, for example, continue.
Understood. And just briefly to round out Indo-Pacific, some notable security ties agreements between Japan and the Philippines. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, indeed. Japan and the Philippines agreed to deepen their defense cooperation. And this is building on an agreement that was signed about a year and a half ago when both countries signed a reciprocal access agreement, basically facilitating joint training exercises between both sides' armed forces. But this new upgrade, as it were, is more focused on supplies and logistics, allowing both countries to use each other's hubs, both on terms of transport, but also supplies a lot quicker. So, here again, kind of taking precautions with the more assertive stance that China has been displaying, especially in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea. And it should be noted, as we're on the topic of Japan, that the Prime Minister of Japan made some very strong hints at potentially calling a snap election at the beginning of February. And polls at the moment would see a potential strengthening of her position, as her party seems to still be doing quite well. But we're seeing a lot of scuffling domestically, with a lot of coalitions being formed on the opposition camp. So this is definitely something that we're going to be covering, if not next week, then in the weeks to follow. But for now, indeed, those alliances still holding strong and deepening in the face of the more assertive Chinese stance.
Understood. So let's move on to our final global hotspot, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where we've seen some notable updates on the diplomatic side. So Andrew, what can you update us there?
Yeah, so the big story out of diplomacy with Ukraine this week is that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that his senior negotiators are wrapping up the final details on what he's calling a historic security guarantees document. And then he is trying to arrange a meeting with representatives of President Trump in order to get that signed. A couple of other interesting notes on that. Both U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been publicly very optimistic about this current security guarantees proposal, especially after the meeting that we discussed last week in Paris that took place January 6th through 7th. Immediately following the Paris summit, Trump himself was also fairly optimistic publicly in his comments on the security guarantees. Very recently, though, the U.S. president said that he believes the Russian president is keen to end the war in Ukraine, and that Volodymyr Zelensky was the one, quote, holding up the effort. I'm not sure exactly what prompted this latest rebuke from the president towards Zelensky. The final thing I'll note there is that in Zelensky's comments, he has slightly modified his framing of the situation. Last week, there was a lot of talk of Zelensky trying to plan another in-person meeting with himself and Trump, and now he is talking about sending senior representatives. Regardless, I think that we can expect to see something brought to Washington within the next week or so.
Gotcha. And I think it's worth noting here that amid this diplomatic activity, we are still seeing the continuation of both military and hybrid activities as well, with this past week, U.S. officials accusing Russia of a, quote, dangerous and inexplicable escalation of the war. And this was following the launch of a nuclear-capable Oreshnik missile that Russia had launched and struck Ukraine near its border with Poland. And Russia has also been intensifying its winter campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which has led to sustained power outages across Ukraine and prompted Zelensky to announce a state of emergency in Ukraine's energy sector. So, even as we're seeing diplomatic activity still very much active on both the military and hybrid fronts. Well, that's about all that we have time for today. Before we wrap up, Andrew, were there any quick hits that you wanted to mention?
Definitely. In the U.S. right now, there are ongoing protests in Minneapolis following the killing of an unarmed U.S. citizen, Renee Good, by ICE officials on January 7th, as well as the shooting of a Venezuelan immigrant who was hospitalized after being wounded by ICE agents, also in Minneapolis on January 13th. At present, there are thousands of ICE agents currently in Minneapolis, and as of today, Trump has threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act inside Minnesota. Looking globally now to Uganda, where authorities have imposed a nationwide internet blackout. This comes in the days leading up to the country's general election, which is scheduled to take place today, January 15th. And this follows months of police crackdowns against opposition leaders and their supporters as the sitting president in Uganda seeks a seventh term.
Gotcha. So we'll have to leave it there. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.